The plate held only three things: a chicken bone stripped nearly clean, a spoonful of rice too small to fill a child's palm, and a piece of bread so stale its edges had begun to curl. That plate was set in front of a 68-year-old widow at her own husband's funeral, in front of nearly 200 guests, by her husband's own sister. The widow's name was Adwoa Sarpong. She sat at the long fellowship hall table in a simple black dress, her back straight, her face calm, her hands folded once in her lap before she reached for the plate. She looked first at the food. Then she looked at the woman who had served it. Then she looked at the room full of people pretending not to stare. The hall smelled of gravy, baked chicken, perfume, and polished wood. Forks slowed. Conversations weakened. Eyes moved and then quickly moved away. Everyone understood what had happened. Everyone knew humiliation when they saw it. But humiliation delivered in silence, in public, under church lights and funeral flowers, carried a special kind of cruelty. The woman who had served the scraps was Ya Boteng, Kofi Sarpong's older sister. She stood with a smile that was too neat to be kind. It was the smile of someone who wanted witnesses. It was the smile of someone who believed the moment belonged to her. Adwoa said nothing. She did not cry. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She picked up the stale bread, broke off a corner, and ate it slowly. There was no tremble in her hand. No flash of anger in her eyes. Only a stillness so deep it made the silence in the room feel even louder. People mistook that silence for weakness. They were about to learn how wrong they were. If anyone in that room had bothered to study Adwoa's face, they would have noticed it. Not anger. Not fear. Not even defeat. What lived there was something steadier than all of those things. It was endurance. It was the look of a woman who had suffered insult before and had learned that some truths did not need to be shouted to become powerful. 47 minutes later, a man in a black suit would walk from the back of that church hall to the front. He would set a leather briefcase on the table, click the brass locks open, remove 9 pages, and read words that would break the woman who had served those scraps. But in that moment, none of the guests knew what was coming. They only knew the room felt strange. As if the air itself were waiting. Near the back wall stood Kwame Ofori, Kofi Sarpong's attorney. He had arrived quietly and taken a seat where he could see everyone without being seen too closely himself. He did not interrupt the meal. He did not announce himself. He simply watched, hands folded over the handle of his briefcase, taking in the same scene everybody else saw but perhaps understanding it more fully than anyone in that hall. Adwoa ate one more small bite of bread and set the rest down. Ya turned away, satisfied too early. The guests slowly picked up their forks again, though conversation did not fully recover. What none of them understood was that the public insult they had just witnessed would soon become the frame around a public reckoning. A legal reading would become a moral one. And the scraps on that paper plate would become the image no one could forget when the truth finally stood up and spoke. 31 years earlier, before the funeral, before the business, before the millions, before grief had a name and a chair and a plate at the table, there had been a rainy afternoon outside a library in Durham, North Carolina. The sky had opened without warning. Water ran down the windows in silver streaks. Students hurried across the sidewalk with books tucked under jackets. The world smelled of wet concrete, paper, and summer rain. Kofi Sarpong was 25, ambitious, tired, brilliant, and so drenched that his shirt clung to his shoulders when he pushed through the library doors. He was finishing an MBA at Duke on scholarship, balancing classes, deadlines, and the private pressure of a man who believed his whole future depended on not wasting a single opportunity. He carried himself with purpose, but that afternoon he looked almost comical standing in the entryway with rain dripping from his cuffs. Behind the front desk sat Adwoa, 22 years old, studying accounting at night and working library hours during the day. She was organized, observant, and not easily impressed. Her hair was neatly pulled back. Her expression was composed. She had already learned how to read people in seconds. She looked up, saw the soaked young man in front of her, and waited. Kofi asked for a book on corporate tax law and, if possible, a towel. Adwoa slid a stack of paper towels across the counter instead, pointed him toward the correct aisle, and did not smile. but something in the exchange stayed with him. Maybe it was the way she refused to fuss over him. Maybe it was the certainty in her voice. Maybe it was the fact that she seemed unimpressed by the kind of charm that had worked on other people. Whatever it was, Kofi found the book he needed that day. But it was not the only thing he decided he wanted to return for. He came back the next Tuesday. Then the Tuesday after that. And then the Tuesday after that. Always around the same time. Always with some reasonable excuse. A reference book. A question about the business section. A request for a printer code. At first Adwoa let him play the game. She answered politely, sometimes briefly, sometimes without even looking up for long. But she noticed the pattern almost immediately. Kofi was not loud in his interest. He did not perform it. He simply kept showing up. He asked about classes when she seemed tired. He remembered the order in which she restocked the returns cart. He learned which days the library felt busiest and which minutes near closing left enough space for a real conversation. Little by little, what began as an excuse turned into a ritual. By the third week Adwoa had decided two things. First, the man was persistent. Second, she wanted to know whether that persistence meant anything beyond nerves. So when Kofi lingered one Tuesday pretending to study a shelf he had already scanned twice, she lifted an eyebrow and said, "Are you going to keep pretending to browse, or are you finally going to ask me to dinner?" Kofi laughed in surprise, then in relief. The tension broke. The rain from their first meeting was gone, replaced by the ordinary fluorescent quiet of a weekday library, yet for both of them the room felt different. He asked. She said yes. Not with dramatic softness or flirty hesitation, but with the same plain certainty she used for everything that mattered. And that was the beginning. Not fireworks. Not a cinematic sweep. Just two serious young people recognizing something dependable in each other before either one fully understood what it would one day become. They were both broke. That is one of the facts that mattered most because it stripped the beginning of everything false. There were no expensive dates, no polished performances, no one trying to impress the other with a version of life they could not sustain. They shared fries because they could not afford 2 full meals. They stretched one soda between them and laughed over the awkwardness of it. The restaurant booths were cracked. The plates were plain. The future was uncertain. And still those evenings felt rich. Kofi fell first. Not because Adwoa made herself easy to love, but because she made honesty feel safe. When he talked about numbers, strategy, and the kind of company he wanted to build one day, she listened as if dreams were not foolish just because they were expensive. Adwoa took longer. She believed in consistency more than charm. She paid attention to whether he kept his word. And Kofi did. If he said he would call, he called. If he said he would come by, he came by. If he said he would help, he showed up. That steady reliability became its own language between them. In a season of life when everything else felt fragile, rent, grades, jobs, sleep, tomorrow Kofi became someone whose presence could be counted on. Adwoa trusted slowly, but once she saw the pattern, she could not ignore it. Neither of them had much money. Both of them had pride. Both of them understood work. So love did not arrive dressed like fantasy. It arrived in punctuality, paper napkins, shared food, and long conversations about the kind of lives they wanted to build. By the time Adwoa finally allowed herself to admit what Kofi already knew, the bond between them was no longer a possibility. It was already becoming a foundation. They married in a courthouse in 1996. No orchestra. No chandelier ballroom. No display meant for other people. Just legal vows, a few witnesses, nervous smiles, and the quiet certainty that they were choosing the right person while they still owned very little else. Adwoa wore simple clothes. Kofi's suit was modest. What they lacked in ceremony they made up for in clarity. They were not marrying for comfort. They were marrying for partnership. 3 months later they moved to Charlotte for Kofi's new job. The apartment they rented was small enough that every sacrifice became visible. The kitchen table was close to the couch. The bedroom closet forced compromise. Bills were stacked carefully. Groceries were planned. They learned the cost of everything and the value of each other's steadiness under pressure. Those early years were not glamorous. Kofi worked long hours trying to prove himself. Adwoa balanced jobs, studies, records, and the invisible labor that keeps a struggling household from falling apart. At night they sat at the same kitchen table beneath a tired light, one set of books open beside another, building credentials and discipline at the same time they were building a marriage. There were evenings when exhaustion sat between them like a third person. Even then they found ways to keep choosing each other. A hand on the shoulder while one of them reviewed figures. A reheated meal saved for the one coming home later. A joke traded across notebooks when both were too tired to do more than smile. Their future was not born from comfort. It was shaped by repetition, by sacrifice, by 1,000 unremarkable nights when both of them could have surrendered to fatigue and instead kept going. That was the real beginning of the life everyone else would later envy. When Kofi launched Sarpong Financial Group in 2001, it did not look like the beginning of a company that would one day be worth millions. It looked like a risk. The office was tiny. The furniture was modest. The phones did not ring enough. There were days when optimism had to work harder than cash flow. Yet Kofi saw possibility everywhere. He had the vision to imagine a firm that could serve clients with intelligence, discipline, and trust. What he needed was someone strong enough to help carry the dream when vision alone was not enough. That someone was Adwoa. She became the first employee before there were really employees to speak of. She was the bookkeeper, the office manager, the scheduler, the cleaner, the organizer, the steady voice on the phone, and the person who remembered every detail that mattered. Kofi met clients, made plans, and opened doors. Adwoa made sure there was a structure behind every promise. She balanced the books. She answered phones. She tracked bills. She prepared files. She noticed what was missing before it became a crisis. When money was tight, she invested her own savings because she believed in him before the wider world had any reason to. When the office needed to look polished for a client visit, she stayed late to clean it herself. When food was needed for meetings, she brought it. When encouragement was needed, she gave it without turning herself into the center of the story. Kofi had the public face of ambition. Adwoa had the private discipline that kept ambition from collapsing. Together they made something more durable than success. They built trust. And trust, once earned and properly managed, became the true engine behind everything that followed. The company grew the way many great things grow in real life, slower than hoped at first, then steadily enough that one day people turn around and realize the small beginning has become substantial. One client became 3. 3 became a network. A network became referrals, repeat business, new offices, larger accounts, and a reputation that extended beyond the room where it began. Through every phase, Adwoa remained beside Kofi, not in ceremonial support but in practical partnership. She was there for the hard calls and the good quarters. She was there when a client had to be reassured and when an employee needed direction. She was there when payroll felt heavy and when success began to look real. She understood the numbers because she had helped make them honest. She understood the culture because she had helped shape it. She knew which promises had been expensive, which sacrifices had gone unseen, and which victories had been earned the slow way. Years passed. The tiny office became something larger. Then larger still. By the time Kofi died, the estate they had built together was worth approximately $147 million. A house in Charlotte. A vacation property. An Atlanta rental complex. Investment accounts. Ownership stakes. A charitable foundation. Personal effects accumulated over a life of work and care. But almost nobody knew the true size of what they owned. The neighbors saw modesty, not display. The church saw consistency, not wealth. Even many people close to the family saw a comfortable couple, not an empire built with patience. Adwoa and Kofi never made their success into theater. They wore it lightly. They lived with gratitude rather than spectacle. Which is why, when the truth finally surfaced, the shock in that fellowship hall hit so hard. People were not only discovering money. They were discovering a history hidden in plain sight. Kofi's older sister, Yaboteng, had stayed in Houston. Life had not been gentle with her. The years had left marks, disappointments, frustrations, financial strain, old hurts that had never found a clean place to rest. None of that excused what she became, but it helped explain the bitterness she fed until it began shaping the way she interpreted everything. As Kofi's life improved, Ya's resentment deepened. She watched from a distance as her younger brother advanced, married, built, and prospered. Instead of seeing the years of sacrifice behind that progress, she told herself a simpler story, that Adwoa had taken him away. That Adwoa had turned him from his family. That Adwoa stood between Kofi and the people who had known him first. None of it was true. But resentment does not need truth to survive. It only needs repetition. So for 31 years Ya repeated that story to herself until it hardened into certainty. She mocked Adwoa's cooking. She criticized her manners. She insulted her in her own home. She carried herself as if Adwoa were a guest in a life she herself had a better claim to. Sometimes the cruelty came dressed as a joke. Sometimes it came as direct contempt. Sometimes it arrived in the form of correction no one had asked for. All of it was designed to diminish. Adwoa almost never answered cruelty with cruelty. She did not match insult for insult. She did not compete for volume. She simply endured it. Not because she could not speak, but because she understood that some people are arguing with a wound, not a fact. Kofi saw it. He knew it. He helped Ya for years because she was family. But he also watched the pattern. He watched who was quietly building and who was steadily tearing at what had been built. And he remembered all of it. It is easy to praise grace when it is abstract. It is much harder to live with it when grace means swallowing the sharp edge of another person's envy over and over again. Adwoa learned that kind of grace the hard way. At family dinners, she smiled through comments meant to embarrass her. In her own house, she listened while Ya criticized the food, the seating, the timing, the tone of a conversation, the way a room had been arranged, the way a wife had welcomed guests. She gave Ya less resistance than Ya seemed to crave, and somehow that only fed the hostility more. Kofi noticed the insults because he loved his wife and because he was not blind. He also noticed something else. Adwoa never asked him to choose sides. She never weaponized his loyalty against his sister. She never demanded public correction to satisfy her own pride. That restraint cost her something. It always does. But she bore the cost because she valued peace more than performance and dignity more than spectacle. The people around them did not always understand what they were seeing. Some mistook silence for weakness. Some assumed the problem must be mutual because many people struggle to believe one person can remain calm while another person keeps picking a fight. But Kofi understood the truth clearly. He saw a wife who had entered his life with discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice, then remained steady through years of pettiness she had not earned. That mattered more than Ya knew. Every slight she delivered went somewhere. Every insult was witnessed by the man she imagined she could influence. Every cruel little act added weight to a judgment being formed quietly, patiently, over decades. By the time the funeral came, the final verdict had already been written. It only had not yet been read aloud. Kofi died on a Saturday morning in June, sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee still warm in his hand. There are deaths that arrive after warning and deaths that split a life in two with no permission at all. This was the second kind. The porch was peaceful. The air was mild. Morning light rested over the yard with the calm indifference nature often keeps when human hearts are about to break. Adwoa found him there. For a moment the world refused to make sense. The mug. The chair. The stillness. The terrible gap between a body and the familiar presence that used to inhabit it. She held his hand. It was one of those gestures grief performs before the mind catches up, as if touch itself might argue with reality. But reality did not move. The man who had shown up for her every time he promised he would had gone somewhere she could not follow. There was no time to collapse in the way her body might have wanted. Death creates paperwork, calls, arrangements, visitors, expectations. It creates logistics even while the soul is in shock. So Adwoa did what many strong people do when their hearts are cracked open. She kept moving because there were things that had to be done. She prepared to bury the man she had built her whole life with. She called who needed to be called. She opened the doors grief forces open. She received condolences. She entered the machinery of mourning while part of her remained on that porch beside the still warm coffee, suspended in the impossible first hour of loss. It should have been a time for gentleness. It should have been a time for protection. Instead, it became the very moment Ya decided to take control. After Kofi's death, Ya moved as if grief had given her permission to seize the center of the story. She replaced the hymns. She changed the flowers. She rewrote the obituary. She pushed Adwoa out of the master bedroom as though widowhood could be managed like a seating chart and authority belonged to whoever spoke most aggressively. She behaved less like a grieving sister and more like a woman finally claiming a stage she believed had been denied to her for years. The cruelty was made sharper by timing. Adwoa was not confronting Ya from a place of equal energy. She was hollowed by loss, moving through rooms that still held Kofi's voice in memory while his absence echoed from every object. The smell of his shirts. The chair on the porch. The habits of a home built around two people instead of one. Into that rawness stepped Ya with instructions, corrections, replacements, and judgments. Still Adwoa said almost nothing. She did not start a scene. She did not drag private tensions into public display. But grief had not taken her intelligence. Quiet did not mean passive. Beneath the restraint, she made one clear decision. Privately, she called Kofi's attorney Kwame Ofori. Her voice, though worn with sorrow, remained precise. She told him she wanted the will read at the repast in front of everyone. No backroom. No delayed appointment. No private conference where truth could later be spun or denied. She wanted witnesses. Not because she desired revenge, but because she understood the kind of atmosphere Ya was creating. Public humiliation had been chosen as a weapon. Public truth then would be the answer. Kwame understood immediately. He did not dramatize the request. He simply agreed. And with that, the balance of the coming funeral changed, though no one else yet knew it. On the morning of the funeral, the house was full of the strange energy that gathers before public mourning. Fabric bags opened on beds, shoes lined near walls, voices kept lower than usual yet sharpened by stress, grief and vanity colliding in equal measure. Adwoa dressed simply in black. No grand display. No decorative attempt to perform widowhood for spectators. Just a plain, dignified dress chosen by a woman whose sorrow was real enough not to need embellishment. Ya looked at her and saw another chance to wound. She said Adwoa looked like the help, not the widow. It was a vicious line, sharp in the way only practiced contempt can be. It reduced grief to costume and dignity to class insult. Yet even then Adwoa did not give her the scene she wanted. She absorbed the words the way she had absorbed so many others, not without pain, but without surrendering her composure. Daniel, Ya's son, heard the remark and knew exactly what it was. Shame crossed his face. Somewhere along the years he had learned to recognize the ugliness in his mother's behavior even when he lacked the power to stop it. Before they left for church, he moved quietly toward Adwoa and apologized in a low voice for what had been said. Adwoa looked at him with a softness that pain had not managed to erase. She told him, "When someone is cruel to you, it tells you everything about them and nothing about you." For Daniel, the sentence landed like a private lesson. For Adwoa, it was more than wisdom offered to comfort a younger man. It was a summary of the principle that had guided her through decades of mistreatment. Other people's cruelty could bruise you, but it did not get to define you unless you handed it that authority. She refused to hand over that much. The church service ended, and the crowd moved from sanctuary to fellowship hall in that slow, murmuring procession common after funerals. Grief changed shape once food appeared. Black clothes gathered around buffet trays. Church ladies rearranged serving spoons. Men who had cried in the pews now cleared their throats and spoke in lowered voices. Children, sensing the seriousness without fully understanding it, moved more carefully than usual around the edges of tables. Ya placed herself near the food as though the line itself were a station of power. She served herself first, piling meat, rice, vegetables, and bread high onto her own plate. No one missed the symbolism of that either, though few would have said it aloud. Then, with that same controlled expression, she prepared a plate for Adwoa. A nearly bare chicken bone. A tiny spoon of rice. A stale piece of bread. She carried it over and set it down with a smile meant to humiliate. The plate was paper, light enough that it shifted slightly when it touched the table. But the gesture behind it landed heavy. Conversations died. Forks stopped in midair. Even people who had spent years pretending not to notice Ya's behavior could not pretend their way past this. Humiliation becomes larger when a room is forced to watch it. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright. The clink of silverware in other parts of the hall sounded far away. Adwoa sat inside that public silence and remained composed. Not unhurt. Not unaware. But composed. In the corner of the room, Kwame Ofori remained still. He had seen enough now to understand that Kofi's written words were about to enter not merely a family dispute, but a moral stage on which every witness had already taken a seat. Ya leaned close enough that only Adwoa could hear her clearly. Her voice was soft but not kind. "This is what you deserve," she whispered. "Scraps. And whatever Kofi left belongs to his family, not to you." There it was. Not just insult but assumption. Not just cruelty but entitlement. Ya believed blood alone gave her claim over what had been built, as though decades of partnership, sacrifice, labor and love were lighter things than shared childhood memories. She believed widowhood could be minimized and marriage reduced. She believed the woman in front of her could be pushed to the outer edge of the life she herself had helped create. Adwoa did not look at her. She looked at the plate for one moment, then somewhere past it, into a distance visible only to someone holding grief and memory at the same time. The room waited, hungry not for food now but for reaction. A gasp. A rebuke. Tears. Anything dramatic enough to release the tension. Instead, Adwoa gave Ya only 2 words. "We'll see." The answer was so quiet that several people missed it. But the ones close enough to hear felt the atmosphere shift. Not because the words were loud. Because they were certain. There was no pleading in them. No defensive anger. No attempt to convince. Just certainty. The kind that comes from either madness or knowledge. And Adwoa was not mad. Ya straightened, misread the moment, and walked away feeling victorious. She thought the silence around her proved power. She thought the widow's calm meant defeat. She did not yet understand that somewhere between the back wall and the front table of that fellowship hall, 47 minutes were quietly counting down to the collapse of everything she thought she knew. Time moves strangely after humiliation. In the minutes that followed, people tried to return to eating, but the room never fully recovered. Conversations restarted in fragments and died again. Some guests kept glancing toward Adwoa. Others watched Ya with the discomfort reserved for someone whose behavior has finally exceeded what politeness can excuse. The hall was full, yet emotionally it felt suspended, as if everyone were waiting for a second thing they could not name. 47 minutes after the plate of scraps had been set down, Kwame Ofori rose from the back of the room. He was dressed in a black suit that matched the solemnity of the day without calling attention to itself. He walked with the calm pace of a man who did not need to rush because his authority did not depend on theatrics. When he reached the front, the room quieted almost immediately. Ya frowned, confused by the interruption. Adwoa lifted her eyes and met his for only a second before looking down again. Kwame set a leather briefcase on the table. The metal locks clicked open with a sound small enough to be ordinary and sharp enough to be unforgettable in that silence. He removed 9 pages and announced that Kofi Sarpong's final will and testament had been signed, witnessed, and notarized 6 months before his death. Now the room was completely still. Not one chair scraped. Not one fork moved. The smell of food, once dominant, seemed to retreat before the gravity of paper and law. Kwame's voice was measured, professional, and unshaken. He was not here to speculate. He was here to read. And once he began, the fellowship hall ceased to be merely a place for a funeral meal. It became a courtroom without a judge, because judgment had already been written and all that remained was for the truth to be heard. Kwame began with Adwoa. The Charlotte house. The vacation property. The Atlanta rental complex. The investment accounts. The ownership stake in the company. The charitable foundation. All personal effects. Each item fell into the room with the weight of revelation. With every line, guests glanced toward Adwoa and then back at Kwame as though the list itself might change if they looked away for too long. But it did not change. It only grew. Then Kwame read the total estimated value, approximately $147 million. A collective shock moved through the hall like wind through dry leaves. People who had known Kofi for years looked stunned. Church members who had admired the couple's modesty now realized they had only glimpsed a fraction of the life those two had built. Employees in attendance exchanged looks that held equal parts surprise and understanding. Some of them knew enough of the firm's success to believe the number, but even they had not expected to hear it declared like this. Adwoa did not move dramatically. She did not clutch her chest or cover her mouth. The wealth being described was not news to her in the way it was to everyone else. She had balanced the books of its beginnings. She had seen the years of labor behind the assets. For her, the reading was not about discovering value. It was about something deeper and far more personal, public acknowledgement of what had always been true. Ya, however, could not remain seated. She stood so abruptly her chair scraped the floor. She said it was impossible. She insisted there had to be another will, another version, another arrangement more favorable to the story she had spent years telling herself. Kwame did not flinch. Professional calm remained on his face, the kind of calm that knows outrage is not evidence and volume is not law. When the room had absorbed enough of the first shock to breathe again, Kwame turned the page and continued. Now he read Ya Boateng's inheritance. A framed photograph of their mother. And the family Bible. Nothing more. The simplicity of it stunned the room in a new way. It was not merely that Ya had been excluded from wealth. It was the precision of what she had been given. Memory. Heritage. Sentiment. Not punishment disguised as paperwork, but symbolism sharpened into legal form. Kofi had not forgotten his sister. He had remembered her exactly enough to tell the truth. Ya's face changed as the meaning reached her. For a brief second, anger still tried to protect pride. But beneath it came something rawer, the realization that this outcome had not been improvised in grief. It had been chosen in clarity months before death, after years of observation. Kwame continued. Trust funds for Daniel and his sister Nadia. A profit-sharing pool for loyal employees. Kofi's generosity had not disappeared, it had simply been directed with care. He had not abandoned family. He had distinguished between those who shared his blood and those who had shared his burdens. That distinction cut deeper than the money itself. Around the room, people shifted in their seats as private memories rearranged themselves. Comments once dismissed as family tension now took on a different shape. Old meals, old gatherings, old sharp remarks, old silences, many were now being reinterpreted through the structure of a will that felt less like a surprise and more like a final summary. Kofi had known. Kofi had seen. Kofi had judged. And because he was no longer alive to soften the truth with diplomacy, the paper now did what his living voice had perhaps chosen not to do in public. It named what mattered. But the final blow was not the list of assets. It was Kofi's personal statement. Kwame announced that the next section came directly from Kofi. Then he read words that moved beyond law into testimony. Kofi said everything he built with Adwoa. She had invested her savings when no one else believed in him. She had answered phones, balanced books, cleaned the office, fed clients, and worked beside him for 30 years without asking for recognition. He said the company, the assets, and the life they shared existed because she had stood beside him from the start, not as an accessory to success but as one of its architects. Then he addressed Ya directly. He said he had helped her for years because she was family. He said he had carried obligations quietly because family mattered to him. But he had also watched her belittle his wife for 31 years. He had watched Adwoa endure insult without once trying to divide the family. He had watched her refuse to make him choose sides. He had watched her carry herself with grace under treatment that should have shamed everyone who witnessed it. The room was already emotional by then, but one line shattered whatever distance remained between legal document and human truth. Adwoa is my legacy. She always was. There are sentences that close arguments forever. This was one of them. It did not merely assign property. It assigned meaning. It told the room what Kofi believed the center of his life had been. Not the firm. Not the money. Not the properties. The woman who had shared his hunger, his labor, his long nights, his early risks, his private burdens, and his public success. In that one line, decades of quiet partnership received the full volume of the recognition Adwoa herself had never demanded. When the reading ended, Ya broke down. Anger had finally run out, and without it she had nothing left to shield herself from the truth. Years of resentment, entitlement, and humiliation collapsed under the weight of a reality she could no longer deny. In that fellowship hall, in front of the same room where she had tried to reduce a widow to scraps, she herself became exposed, not by insult but by evidence. And then Adwoa did the one thing nobody expected. She stood, walked toward Ya, and placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture was gentle enough to feel almost unbelievable after everything that had happened. Tears blurred Ya's eyes as she looked up and asked how Adwoa could say anything kind after all she had done. Adwoa answered, "You are still my sister. That has not changed." Ya, stunned, asked how such grace was possible. Adwoa said, "Because hate is heavier than grief and I am already carrying enough." That was the moment the room truly understood her. Not because of the money. Not because of the will. But because after 31 years of cruelty, and on the worst day of her life, she still chose dignity over revenge. Wealth could not create that. Law could not force it. Character had carried her there. That evening Adwoa returned alone to the house, stepped onto the porch where Kofi used to sit, and watched the Charlotte sky burn orange and purple. She held his coffee mug in both hands and whispered, "They heard you, my love." Every word. If Ya had served her a full plate that day, the will still would have been read. The truth still would have come out. But those scraps turned a legal reading into a reckoning. In one small act of cruelty, the whole room finally saw the difference between a woman who takes and a woman who gives. Adwoa never begged for recognition. She simply kept showing up. And in the end, the truth stood up, opened a briefcase and spoke for her.